The Morning Post had arrived at 8:30, as it always did. Mrs. Evelyn Alcott was found dead at 9. The constable noted, without particular interest, that 3 letters lay unopened on her hall table. Her neighbours confirmed she had been expecting one, had spoken of little else for a fortnight. She had not opened a single one. A woman who checks her letterbox before her kettle boils does not leave 3 letters untouched unless she never had the chance, or unless she already knew what was inside. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where the quietest English mornings hide the most deliberate of crimes. Tonight, we visit the village of Ashenford, where the post arrives faithfully every day, and someone was counting on exactly that. This is Death Came with the Morning Post. Chapter 1. The Letters on the Table. The village of Ashenford had a particular way of beginning its mornings. The bakery on Croft Lane put out its trays at 7. The church bells struck the quarter hour with a slight hesitation on the 3rd chime, a mechanical peculiarity so familiar that residents had long since stopped hearing it. The postman, Mr. Gerald Fitch, completed his round in precisely the same order he had maintained for 11 years, beginning at the iron gate of Whitmore House and ending, some 40 minutes later, at the row of stone cottages along Sparrow's End. He was, by all accounts, a punctual and unremarkable man, and the village liked him for it. It was Mrs. Doris Peel who found Evelyn Alcott. She had come with eggs, as she did every Thursday, and let herself through the side gate, because the front was always stiff in damp weather. The kitchen door was unlocked. The kettle sat cold on the range. Mrs. Alcott herself was in the sitting-room, seated in her wing-back chair beside the window that overlooked the lane, the same window from which she had observed 30 years of Ashenford mornings with quiet proprietorial interest. She was dressed. Her hair was pinned. Her hands rested in her lap with an arrangement that struck Mrs. Peel, in the confused first moments, as somehow too composed. As though someone had thought about where to place them. She was quite dead. Dr. Hensley arrived within the hour and gave it as his preliminary opinion that Mrs. Alcott had died sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock that morning, most likely of cardiac failure, a conclusion he offered with the cautious efficiency of a man who preferred not to commit himself before the facts were properly assembled. Mrs. Alcott had, he noted, a history of heart trouble. She was 71. She had lived alone since her husband's death 8 years prior. There was nothing, on the surface of things, that demanded further examination. The constable agreed. He took down Mrs. Peel's statement, noted the unlocked kitchen door, and recorded the 3 letters lying unopened on the hall table as a minor curiosity, the sort of domestic detail that found its way into reports and meant nothing. Miss Jane Marple, who had come to Ashenford 3 days earlier to stay with her old friend Cecily Harding, heard about Evelyn Alcott's death before lunchtime. She heard about it from Mrs. Harding's daily, a capable young woman named Ruth, who had it from the butcher's boy, who had it from Gerald Fitch himself, who was apparently not quite so unremarkable as his reputation suggested, for he had lingered near Whitmore House long enough to see the constable arrive and form a series of opinions which he shared freely on the remainder of his round. They're saying it was her heart, Ruth reported, setting down the lunch tray with the satisfied gravity of one delivering important intelligence. Poor soul. She was a fixture, Mrs. Alcott was, never missed a morning at that window. No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. I don't suppose she did. She said nothing further, and Ruth, who had expected rather more in the way of response, withdrew slightly disappointed. Miss Marple poured her tea and looked out at the garden, where a blackbird was making a determined investigation of the herbaceous border. She was not, as certain people sometimes assumed from her manner, a woman given to leaping at conclusions. She was, rather, a woman who noticed when something did not settle properly, the way a piece in a jigsaw, if forced into the wrong position, creates an almost imperceptible distortion in the picture around it. The 3 unopened letters. That was the thing. She had known Evelyn Alcott only slightly. They had met twice at Cecily's table, and corresponded once or twice on a matter of rose cultivation some years ago. But she had formed a clear enough impression. Mrs. Alcott was a woman of fixed habits and sharp attentions, particularly where correspondence was concerned. Cecily had mentioned just the previous evening that Evelyn had been expecting a letter, something to do with her nephew Arthur, who had apparently written to say he was coming to Ashford for a visit, the first in 4 years, and had promised a date and particulars in his next communication. She had spoken of it at dinner on Wednesday, Cecily said, and again at the post office on Tuesday, to Mrs. Pierce behind the counter. She had been watching for it. The post had arrived at 8:30, as it always did. 3 letters. Unopened. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a small, precise click. The difficulty with a heart that stops at the exact moment the morning post arrives is not that it is impossible. Hearts stop for no reason at all, and always have. The difficulty is the letters. A woman who has waited a fortnight for a particular piece of news does not leave the morning post untouched on her hall table, not unless she was interrupted before she reached it. And if she was interrupted, then someone or something had come to Whitmore House before Gerald Fitch had finished his round. Which meant someone had been there between 8 and 8:30, which meant the death was not, as the constable had recorded it, a quiet and solitary one. Miss Marple rose, straightened her cardigan with 2 small economical movements, and went to find Cecily. She had a call to make that afternoon, and she thought it might be sensible to pay her respects at Whitmore House before the week was out. There was no urgency. There never was with these things, but she wished very much to see those letters. Chapter 2. What Gerald Fitch remembered the following morning brought a thin grey light, and a particular stillness that settles over an English village when it is collectively processing something it does not quite know how to name. Ashford was not, by nature, a dramatic place. It preferred its difficulties manageable, a disputed fence line, a disagreement over the flower show judging, the occasional unfortunate business with a will. Death, when it came, was absorbed into the rhythm of things with a certain practised decorum. But there was something about the unopened letters that had begun quietly to circulate. Miss Marple had said nothing publicly, of course. She had no reason to, and every reason not to. But Cecily Harding, who was a warm-hearted woman with an unfortunately permeable sense of discretion, had mentioned to Ruth that Miss Marple had seemed rather thoughtful about the whole business. Ruth had mentioned this to the butcher's boy. By mid-morning, Gerald Fitch knew that the elderly lady staying at Harding Cottage had taken an interest, and Gerald Fitch, who had been carrying a particular weight since Thursday, found this information a considerable relief. He appeared at Cecily's gate at 10:30. Miss Marple received him in the small sitting-room, where she was engaged in a piece of knitting that she set aside without ceremony. She observed him carefully as he settled into the chair across from her, a compact, weathered man in his mid-50s, with the careful posture of someone who has spent decades moving quietly through other people's mornings. He held his cap in both hands and worked the brim in a slow, involuntary rotation that suggested considerable inner agitation. "You wanted to speak with someone," Miss Marple said. It was not precisely a question. Gerald Fitch looked briefly startled, then nodded. "I didn't know who to go to," he said. "The constable's written it up as natural causes, which it may well be. I'm not saying otherwise." He paused. "Only there's a thing I didn't mention." "There usually is," said Miss Marple, with great gentleness. He had arrived at Whitmore House, he said, at his usual time, between 8:25 and 8:30, as near as he could judge. He had 3 items for Mrs. Alcott: a bill from the electricity board, a catalogue from a seed company she favoured, and a letter with a London postmark, handwritten, which he had noted particularly because Mrs. Alcott had mentioned to him, not once, but several times over the past 2 weeks, that she was expecting something from London. He had come through the front gate. The side gate, he explained, was properly Mrs. Peel's entrance, and he had his own arrangement with the front latch, which was stiff but manageable if you lifted it at the right angle. He had pushed the letters through the slot. And he had heard voices. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their soft work during his account, paused almost imperceptibly. "Voices," she said. One voice, Gerald Fitch corrected himself, with the precision of a man who had been going over this detail repeatedly. A man's voice, speaking low, not whispering exactly, but low, the way you'd speak if you didn't particularly want to carry. He looked at his cap. "I couldn't make out the words. I wasn't trying to at that point. I just posted the letters and went on." "Was there a reply? A second voice?" He hesitated. "I thought perhaps. But I couldn't be certain. The wall's thick at Whitmore House." Miss Marple considered this. "Did you see anyone? On the lane near the gate, coming or going?" "That's just it," said Gerald Fitch. He looked up, and there was something in his expression that had moved beyond discomfort into something more unsettled. "When I came back down the path, I'd gone up to post the letters, and turned back. It was perhaps 15-20 seconds at most. There was a figure at the end of the lane, turning the corner onto Medlar Street. I only saw them from behind. Man or woman? I believe a man. Dark coat. Moving quickly, but not running. The sort of quick walk that's trying not to look like running." He paused. "I've seen that walk before, I think. But I can't place it. It's been troubling me." Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap. Outside, the blackbird had returned to the herbaceous border. She watched it for a moment without appearing to watch it. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "the letter with the London postmark. You said it was handwritten." "Yes. Could you say anything further about the hand? Was it a young person's writing or older? Careful or hurried?" He thought about this with evident seriousness. "Careful," he said at last. Block letters for the address, not printed but deliberate, the sort of writing that doesn't want to be mistaken for anyone else's. He frowned. Or the sort that doesn't want to be recognized as anyone's. After Gerald Fitch had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time without moving. 3 letters on a table. A man's voice inside the house. A figure leaving quickly, and a letter written in a hand designed to be anonymous, posted to a woman who never had the chance to open it. The nephew, Arthur, had written to say he was coming. He had promised particulars in a second letter. The second letter had arrived on Thursday morning. Arthur Alcott had not been seen in Ashford in 4 years. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, turned it over once in her hands, and placed it in her bag. She would need to learn rather more about Arthur Alcott before the day was out, and she found herself wondering, with the quiet, methodical interest that others sometimes mistook for idle curiosity, precisely why a man who writes to announce his arrival chooses to disguise his handwriting when he does so. Unless, of course, it had not been Arthur who wrote the letter at all. Chapter 3. The nephew who never arrived. Cecily Harding knew everything about everyone in Ashford, in the way that women of a certain age and temperament know things, not through deliberate enquiry, but through the gradual accumulation of details absorbed over decades of proximity. She knew which marriages were comfortable, and which were merely tidy. She knew who had borrowed money and not returned it, and who had returned it with a coldness that made the lender wish they hadn't asked. She knew Evelyn Alcott's history with the particular completeness reserved for long friendships, and she shared it with Miss Marple over lunch, with only the faintest prompting required. Arthur Alcott was Evelyn's brother's son. The brother, Malcolm, had died some 15 years ago, a difficult man by all accounts, fond of schemes that never quite resolved themselves into anything profitable, and possessed of a temper that his neighbours remembered long after his other qualities had faded. Arthur had inherited something of the father's restlessness, without, apparently, the temper. He had spent his 20s moving between positions, something in insurance, then something in property, then a period abroad that Evelyn had referred to only vaguely, and Cecily had never been able to clarify to her own satisfaction. He had visited Ashford 3 times in the 8 years since his uncle Edward's death. The last visit, 4 years ago, had not ended well. "How so?" said Miss Marple, accepting a second slice of bread with quiet efficiency. Cecily arranged her thoughts. There was an argument. About the house, Whitmore House. Edward left everything to Evelyn outright, you understand, which was perfectly proper. They'd been married 31 years. But Arthur had apparently expected, or felt he had been led to expect, some provision. He was Edward's only nephew, after all. She paused. Evelyn never spoke about it directly to me, but Mrs. Pierce at the post office, who really ought to exercise more discretion, but there it is, Mrs. Pierce said they were heard in the garden. Raised voices. Arthur left the following morning without saying goodbye, and Evelyn didn't mention him for the better part of a year. And yet she had been expecting his letter, Miss Marple said. With anticipation, you said. With something, Cecily agreed, in the careful tone of one revising a previous statement. I said anticipation because she mentioned it so frequently. But now that I think, she seemed anxious, more than pleased. She kept saying she needed to know what he intended. Those were her words. What he intended. Miss Marple filed this away without comment. After lunch she put on her coat and walked to the post office, which occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on the High Street and was presided over by Mrs. Pierce, a stout, bright-eyed woman of 60 who regarded the management of local information as very nearly an extension of her official duties. She greeted Miss Marple with the particular warmth reserved for visitors whose presence might yield an interesting exchange. "Terrible business," Mrs. Pearce said, before Miss Marple had done more than remark upon the weather. "Poor Evelyn. Her heart, they're saying, though I must say I'm not entirely settled in my mind about it. She seemed perfectly well on Tuesday, came in for a stamp, just the one, and asked whether there had been anything for her that morning." Which was unusual, because Gerald always delivers directly, so she would have known already if something had come, unless, said Miss Marple mildly, she was inquiring about something that might have been held at the counter. Mrs. Pearce blinked. "Well, now that you mention it, she did ask, specifically, whether anything had come requiring a signature. I told her no. She seemed relieved, perhaps, or perhaps disappointed. It was difficult to say. Did she mention her nephew at all?" Something shifted in Mrs. Pearce's expression, a brief internal negotiation between discretion and the stronger competing impulse. She mentioned that Arthur was planning to come. She said she hoped to have things straightened out before he arrived. Mrs. Pearce lowered her voice to the register she reserved for significant information. She used the word settled. That she wanted it all settled. I assumed she meant the house. There had been that business 4 years ago about whether Edward's estate had been properly handled. Arthur apparently had some notion that certain investments hadn't been fairly accounted for. Did he pursue that notion formally? I believe there were letters to a solicitor. Nothing came of it. But Evelyn kept the correspondence. I know that because she mentioned once that she kept everything related to Arthur in a separate folder, in a bureau in the sitting room. Mrs. Pearce paused meaningfully. "The one with the brass fittings," she said. "She was very particular about it." Miss Marple thanked her and walked back through the village at the unhurried pace of a woman enjoying the autumn air. A bureau with brass fittings in the sitting room of Whitmore House. She thought about where such a bureau would stand in relation to the wing-back chair by the window, and whether a person seated in that chair, in the composed and deliberate arrangement that had struck Mrs. Peel as somehow too considered, would have been facing it. She thought about a man's voice, speaking low, a figure leaving quickly, and she thought about a woman who had wanted things settled before her nephew arrived, and who had died in her best chair on the morning his letter finally came. The question was not only who had been in that house between 8 and 8:30. The question was what they had been looking for, and whether, in the bureau with the brass fittings, they had found it.
Whitmore House had passed, presumably, to Arthur Alcott. He had not yet appeared in Ashenford to claim it. That, Miss Marple felt, was a peculiarity worth examining with some care. Chapter 4. The Bureau with Brass Fittings. Whitmore House had been closed since Thursday. The constable had seen no reason to treat it otherwise. Natural causes produced no crime scene, and the brief administrative inconvenience of an unattended death did not, in his estimation, extend to restricting acting access to a private residence.
He had made a note of the next of kin, sent a telegram to the address Evelyn Alcott's solicitor provided for Arthur Alcott, and considered the matter largely administrative from that point forward. The house sat behind its iron gate with the particular stillness of a place whose occupant has departed without warning, curtains drawn, post accumulating on the hall table. Miss Marple paid a call on Margaret Dowell. Margaret Dowell was 73, lived in the cottage directly adjacent to Whitmore House, and had been Evelyn Alcott's nearest neighbour for 26 years. She was also, as Miss Marple had ascertained through Cecily, the holder of a spare key, a practical arrangement that had begun years ago when Evelyn had locked herself out during a particularly uncooperative February, and had simply continued by mutual agreement ever since. She was a small, dry woman with sharp hearing and the watchful economy of movement that comes from living alone for a long time. She admitted Miss Marple without apparent surprise, as though she had been expecting someone to come and simply wasn't certain who it would be. The constable didn't ask about the key, she said, before Miss Marple had introduced the subject. No, said Miss Marple. I don't suppose he did. I keep it on the hook by the back door. Anyone who knows this house well enough would know that arrangement. She looked at Miss Marple steadily. I've been thinking about that. They sat in Margaret Dowell's kitchen, which smelled of wood polish and dried lavender, and Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle comfortably before asking whether Mrs. Dowell had noticed anything on Thursday morning, a visitor, a voice, any movement near Whitmore House before Mrs. Peel arrived with the eggs. Mrs. Dowell folded her hands on the table. I was in the garden from about 8 o'clock. The far end, by the wall, cutting back the clematis. I wouldn't have seen the front of the house from there. She paused with the precision of someone who has rehearsed the boundaries of what they know. But I heard the gate. The iron gate at the front, it has a particular sound, a double click when it's opened properly. I heard it at roughly 8:20. Before the post? Before Gerald, yes. Gerald comes at past, regular. This was earlier. Did you hear it close again? That's the thing, said Mrs. Dowell quietly. I heard it open. I didn't hear it close. I assumed it had simply been pulled to without latching. People do with iron gates. But I've been thinking since, and I believe it was left open deliberately. Someone who intended to leave quickly wouldn't stop to close a gate properly. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mrs. Dowell, would you be willing to accompany me to Whitmore House with your key? I have no official standing, of course, and I would not ask you to do anything that sat uneasily with you. But there is something I should very much like to look at, and I believe it is better looked at before Arthur Alcott arrives to take possession. Margaret Dowell rose without deliberation and took the key from the hook by the back door. Whitmore House had the cold, suspended quality of an interrupted life. The hall table held 4 letters now, Thursday's 3, and one more delivered Friday morning in ignorance of the circumstances. The sitting room was precisely as Mrs. Peel had described it, the wing-back chair by the window, the cold grate, the faint smell of lavender water that had been Evelyn Alcott's particular habit. The bureau with brass fittings stood against the wall opposite the window. It was a handsome piece, Victorian, well maintained, the brass handles polished to the diligent gleam of something regularly attended to. Miss Marple examined it without touching it for a long moment. Then she looked at the floor directly in front of it. There was a faint mark on the floorboard, a scuff, perhaps 4 inches long, of the kind made by a shoe sole sliding forward. Recent, she thought. The wax on the surrounding boards had the dull, settled look of months undisturbed. This mark had the slight brightness of fresh disruption. Someone had stood at this bureau and pulled it open in a hurry. She examined the interior carefully. The cubbyholes contained the ordinary materials of a careful woman's correspondence, stamps, a small address book, a bundle of receipts bound with elastic. But the central compartment, which was fitted with a small interior drawer, showed something that Miss Marple found considerably more interesting than its contents. The drawer was closed, but not quite flush, a fraction of an inch, enough to suggest it had been replaced hastily. without checking the fit. She opened it with her handkerchief protecting her fingers. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter dated 6 weeks prior, a small photograph, and a solicitor's card with a London address. She read the letter carefully twice. It was not from Arthur. It was addressed to Evelyn from a Mr. Clement Bray of Bray and Associates, Holborn, informing her that certain inquiries she had requested had been completed, that the findings were of a serious nature, and that he strongly recommended she seek independent legal counsel before taking any further action regarding the matter of the Alcott estate transfers of 1987 through 1991. Miss Marple set the letter down and picked up the photograph. It showed 2 men outside a building she did not recognize, one middle-aged, one younger. She turned it over. On the back, in Evelyn's careful hand, A. and R. Fenwick. March. No year, no further indication. She replaced everything precisely as she had found it, including the drawer left fractionally open. Then she stood at the window and looked out at the lane, at the iron gate below, and considered what it meant that someone had come to this room in a hurry, searched this bureau, and yet left the letter behind. Either they had not found what they were looking for, or they had found something far more useful than a letter and taken it with them. The central question, she thought, was not yet who. It was what had been in that drawer before Thursday morning and was no longer there now. Chapter 5. The Man from Holborn. Miss Marple wrote 2 letters that evening. The first was to her nephew Raymond, a brief and practical communication requesting that he make certain inquiries through his London connections regarding a firm of solicitors called Bray and Associates of Holborn, and specifically regarding one Clement Bray. She asked for this with the pleasant vagueness of an elderly aunt making a simple request, which was, she had found over many years, considerably more effective than precision when one wished something done quickly and without unnecessary questions. The second letter was to Inspector Slack, whom she had encountered on previous occasions, and with whom she maintained the careful mutual regard of 2 people who have been useful to one another without entirely enjoying the experience. She did not, in this letter, make any accusations. She simply noted that she happened to be staying in Ashenford, that she had known Mrs. Alcott slightly, and that there were 1 or 2 small details about Thursday morning which she thought might interest him, at his convenience. She sealed both envelopes and gave them to Cecily's Ruth to post first thing in the morning. Then she sat by the window with her knitting and thought about the photograph. A. and R. Fenwick. 2 men, 1 older, 1 younger. March, with no year. The building behind them was commercial in character. She had noted a revolving door, a brass plate beside the entrance too small to read, and what appeared to be the edge of a London street sign at the far left of the frame. The older man had the bearing of someone accustomed to small offices and careful language. The younger man was looking slightly away from the camera, his face turned perhaps 20 degrees to the left, which gave the photograph an unposed quality, suggesting the picture had been taken without full cooperation. She did not know either face. But Evelyn had known them well enough to label them, and to keep the photograph in the same drawer as a solicitor's letter concerning irregularities in the Alcott estate. The name Fenwick had not come up in Ashenford. That in itself was a kind of information. Clement Bray arrived in Ashenford on Saturday afternoon. Miss Marple did not arrange this. It arranged itself, in the way that things sometimes do when enough questions have been put quietly into circulation. Mrs. Pearce at the post office mentioned to Cecily on Saturday morning that a gentleman had telephoned the village inn, the Harrow and Hare, the only establishment offering rooms, and made a reservation for Saturday and Sunday night. He had given his name as Bray, Mrs. Pierce had this from Janet Rollins, who managed the inn's bookings and had a long-standing information-sharing arrangement with the post office that neither party formally acknowledged. Miss Marple walked to the Harrow and Hare at 4 o'clock. She found Mr. Clement Bray in the small residence lounge, occupying an armchair near the fire, with a cup of tea he had not touched and a newspaper he was not reading. He was somewhere in his early 60s. A composed, grey-suited man, with the deliberate stillness of someone who spent his professional life managing other people's difficulties. He looked up when she entered with the cautious assessment of a man not entirely surprised to receive a visitor, though uncertain which visitor had arrived. Miss Marple sat in the adjacent chair and remarked pleasantly on the drive from London, which she imagined had been tiresome on a Saturday. He agreed that it had been, and looked at her with careful attention. "You were Evelyn Alcott's solicitor," she said, in the tone of one confirming a minor detail. A brief pause. "I was engaged by Mrs. Alcott on a specific matter of enquiry," he said. "I would not characterize myself as her general solicitor. She had a firm in Braxted for her ordinary affairs." He lifted his teacup, then set it down again. "May I ask how you knew to find me here, Miss Marple?" "I'm staying with Cecily Harding." "I knew to find you here because you were expected, Mr. Bray, whether or not you were aware of being expected." She paused. "You've come because Evelyn is dead, and you are uncertain what to do about what you know." The fire settled in the grate. From the bar beyond the closed door came the muffled sound of a Saturday afternoon in progress. Clement Bray looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man rapidly revising a series of assumptions. Then something in his posture shifted, not relaxing precisely, but relinquishing a position that had become uncomfortable to maintain. The inquiries Mrs. Alcott commissioned, he said carefully, related to a series of financial transfers made between 1987 and 1991 during the later period of her husband's business activities. Edward Alcott had a business partner during those years, a man named Robert Fenwick, the older man in the photograph, Miss Marple thought. She said nothing. Fenwick died in 1993. But his son, Adrien Fenwick, has been active in property development in the home counties for the past decade. Mrs. Alcott had reason to believe that certain assets belonging to the Alcott estate had been improperly transferred to the Fenwick partnership during those years, and that Adrien Fenwick was in possession of documentation that would confirm this. She wanted to know whether a legal case was viable. And was it? Potentially, yes. Sufficiently so that I wrote to her 6 weeks ago strongly recommending formal counsel. He paused. I also told her in that letter that Adrien Fenwick had become aware that inquiries were being made. I advised her to be cautious. Miss Marple absorbed this. You mentioned 2 names in your letter, A and R. Fenwick. Something crossed Bray's face, a rapid, uncomfortable attention. I did not use those names in my letter to Mrs. Alcott. The room was very quiet. No, said Miss Marple softly, you didn't. She had read the letter twice, carefully. Bray had referred throughout to the Fenwick matter, to the partnership, to the son, never by first initial. The notation on the photograph, A and R. Fenwick, had been Evelyn's own addition, her own identification, meaning Evelyn had known Adrien Fenwick, had perhaps met him, and had thought it necessary to photograph him without his full awareness, and keep the result in a locked drawer alongside a solicitor's warning to be cautious. The question of who had been in Whitmore House on Thursday morning had just acquired a second possible answer. Mr. Bray was watching her with an expression she recognized, the particular alertness of an intelligent person who has just understood they are in a conversation considerably more advanced than they had prepared for. "Mr. Bray," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "I think you had better tell me everything." Chapter 6. What the partnership concealed. Clement Bray was not by nature an indiscreet man. He had spent 40 years in the careful management of other people's private affairs, and had developed in that time a professional instinct for precisely how much to reveal and to whom, calibrated to the millimetre. He was not easily unsettled. He had sat across from grieving widows and angry heirs, and occasionally from people whose grief and anger were entirely performative, and he had learned to distinguish between them with reasonable accuracy. He had not, however, previously sat across from Miss Marple. He began with the facts, which was his natural mode, and Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting moving with the soft, steady rhythm that seemed to assist rather than distract her attention. Edward Alcott and Robert Fenwick had formed a property partnership in 1983. It was a modest arrangement initially. Two men of similar age and complementary temperament acquiring and managing commercial properties in the outer London boroughs. The kind of slow and glamorous investment that accumulates value without attracting notice. Edward provided capital. Fenwick provided connections and a facility for negotiation that Edward, by all accounts a straightforward and somewhat literal man, did not possess naturally. For 4 years it had worked reasonably well. Then, in 1987, something changed. Bray had found this in the documentation Evelyn had provided him, a collection of papers she had kept, she told him, without entirely understanding their significance, preserved out of the instinct of a careful woman who had watched her husband become increasingly troubled during the late 1980s, and drawn her own private conclusions. Edward Alcott had not been a man who shared his difficulties easily, but he had kept papers, and Evelyn had kept the papers after him, and the papers, read carefully by a man trained to read them, told a story. Between 1987 and 1991, a series of transfers had moved significant assets from the joint partnership account into a separate holding company registered in Fenwick's name alone. The transfers were structured with enough complexity to appear routine to a casual examination, the kind of complexity, Bray noted with professional displeasure, that required assistance from someone with detailed knowledge of how such things are arranged to avoid immediate scrutiny. "How significant?" Miss Marple asked. "In current values," Bray said carefully, "somewhere between £400,000 and £600,000. Depending on how certain properties appreciated." Miss Marple's needles did not pause. "And Edward Alcott knew? I believe he discovered it gradually, between 1989 and 1991. The partnership was formally dissolved in 1991 by mutual agreement, which, given what I now suspect he knew, suggests he was either persuaded to accept a settlement, or persuaded in some other fashion to remain silent." Bray's mouth compressed briefly. Robert Fenwick died in 1993. A heart attack, perfectly documented, 2 years after the dissolution. "Convenient," said Miss Marple mildly. "Edward Alcott died in 2001. He had been, by all accounts, a quieter and somewhat diminished man in his final decade." Bray set down his teacup. "When Evelyn commissioned me, she was not primarily interested in recovering money. She was interested in understanding what had happened to her husband. She She felt that something had broken in him during those years, and she had never been permitted to know what it was. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment outside. The afternoon had begun to grey toward evening, and the light through the lounge windows had acquired the soft, flat quality of approaching dusk. She thought about a woman in a wing-back chair who had spent years keeping papers she didn't fully understand, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, out of loyalty to a husband who had never explained himself. "Adrien Fenwick," she said. "Robert's son. Tell me about him." Bray's expression shifted into something more guarded. "He is 44. He runs a property development company, legitimate, successful, based in Surrey. He inherited his father's assets, which included, though he may not have known it initially, the proceeds of what I believe was systematic fraud against his father's partner." A pause. Or he may have known it very well. I have not been able to establish which. But he became aware that Evelyn was making inquiries. "Yes, I cautioned her about this in my letter. I had reason to believe there was a leak. Someone with access to the public record searches we were conducting, who had the means to identify who had commissioned them." His voice tightened slightly. "I blamed myself for not being more careful in the initial stages. If Evelyn had been placed in danger—" "Mr. Bray," Miss Marple said quietly, "did Evelyn tell you that Arthur Alcott was coming to visit?" The shift in his expression was small, but unmistakable. "She mentioned it, yes. She was conflicted about it. Arthur had been difficult over the estate, as I understood, but she had also recently come to wonder whether Arthur's grievances might have had more foundation than she had previously allowed. If the estate he eventually inherited was already diminished by Fenwick's transfers, then Arthur's complaints about the accounting were not entirely unreasonable." "Precisely." He looked at her steadily. She had written to Arthur, not to admit anything, but to open a conversation. She wanted to see him before she took any formal legal steps. She felt she owed him that. Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, the letter with the London postmark, written in a careful, deliberate hand that did not wish to be recognized. Arthur's letter, or someone else's, sent in anticipation of that conversation. A woman who wanted things settled before her nephew arrived. A bureau searched in the 20 minutes between the gate opening and Gerald Fitch posting the morning letters. 2 men with possible reasons to want Evelyn Alcott's papers before anyone else saw them. One of them had not yet appeared in Ashenford. "Mr. Bray," she said, "do you know whether Arthur Alcott and Adrien Fenwick have ever met?" Bray was silent for a moment. That was answer enough. "I had wondered the same thing," he said at last. "I had rather hoped the answer was no." The fire had burned low. Neither of them moved to attend to it. Miss Marple looked at the grey window and thought about 2 men and a disputed inheritance and a woman who had kept papers for 20 years out of loyalty to a husband who had been quietly broken by a friend. And she thought about the key hanging on the hook at Margaret Dowell's back door. Anyone who knew the house well enough. The question was no longer simply who had been there. It was which of them had known exactly where to look. Chapter 7. Arthur Alcott arrives. He came on Sunday morning in a dark green car that he parked with unnecessary precision outside Whitmore House, as though the straightness of the vehicle relative to the curb were a matter requiring his full attention. Miss Marple, who happened to be passing on the opposite side of the lane, with the unhurried purposefulness of a woman taking her morning constitutional, observed him for the 30 seconds it took him to lock the car, check that it was locked, and stand for a moment looking up at the front of the house with an expression she found difficult to categorize at that distance. It was not grief, exactly. It was not satisfaction. It was the expression of a man confronting something he had been thinking about for a long time and finding the reality of it more complicated than the thought. Arthur Alcott was 51, perhaps 52. Medium height, the kind of build that had once been athletic and had since become merely solid. He wore a good coat badly, in the manner of a man who purchases quality without comfort, and he carried a leather bag that was neither briefcase nor overnight case, but suggested a purposeful combination of both. He had his father's colouring, Cecily had said, dark, with a tendency to heaviness around the jaw. He had not, from what Miss Marple could observe across the width of the lane, his father's temperament. Malcolm Alcott had been volatile. This man had the contained, pressurized quality of someone who had learned to keep things inward, which was, in her experience, considerably more interesting. He did not go immediately to the front door. He stood at the gate for another moment, then turned and walked to the side gate, Mrs. Peel's entrance, and tried it. It was latched from the inside. He returned to the front, produced a key she had not seen him collect from anywhere obvious, and let himself in. He had a key to Whitmore House. That was worth noting. Miss Marple continued her walk as far as the corner, then turned back at a pace that brought her past the Harrow and Hare at the moment Clement Bray was emerging from its front door. He had seen the car from his window, she suspected. His face had the careful blankness of a man composing himself for an encounter he had been rehearsing. "He's here," Bray said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think it might be advisable to give him an hour before either of us makes an approach. He will want to assess the house first." Bray looked at her with the slightly unnerved attention she had noticed in him the previous afternoon. "You expect he'll go straight to the bureau. I expect he'll go straight to wherever he believes the relevant papers are kept. Whether that is the bureau depends on how much he knows about his aunt's habits." She paused. "Did Evelyn mention the bureau specifically in her letter to him?" "I don't know the contents of that letter." "No." She considered. But if she wrote to open a conversation about the Fenwick matter, she may have indicated that she had documentation. A careful woman who has kept papers for 20 years generally mentions that she has kept them. It is, in a sense, the point. She left Bray on the pavement and walked back to Cecily's at a thoughtful pace. The hour she had suggested extended to an hour and a half, because Cecily required assistance locating a particular receipt for the Women's Institute accounts, and Miss Marple provided it with patient efficiency while keeping one portion of her attention directed outward. It was Ruth who brought the news, with the breathless accuracy of someone who had been watching from the kitchen window with professional dedication. "The gentleman from Whitmore House has come out," Ruth announced. "He's standing in the lane. He looks," she searched for the word, "bothered." Miss Marple put on her coat. She found Arthur Alcott where Ruth had described him, standing in the lane outside Whitmore House with his leather bag over his shoulder and an expression that had moved considerably beyond complicated into something raw and less managed. He looked up as she approached with the wariness of a man who is not certain whether an interruption is welcome but lacks the composure at this moment to discourage it. "Mr. Alcott," she said pleasantly, "I am Jane Marple. I was a friend of your aunt's. I'm very sorry for your loss." He accepted this with a brief nod that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal. Did you know her well? Not as well as I should have liked, Miss Marple said truthfully. She was a woman of considerable quality. I believe she had been hoping to see you. Something moved in his face. Yes, he said. She had written. A pause. I should have come sooner. It was said with a flatness that might have been guilt, or might have been the performance of guilt, and Miss Marple did not yet have enough to distinguish between them. She allowed the silence to sit for a moment before asking, with gentle matter-of-factness, whether he had found everything in order inside. His eyes came to her directly then, a sharp assessing look that he moderated almost immediately into something more neutral. The house is fine, he said. There's a bureau in the sitting room, my aunt's correspondence. I was hoping to look through it. A family matter. He paused. The central drawer seems to have been gone through. Things are not quite as she would have left them. Miss Marple looked at him with the mild, interested expression of a woman following the conversation comfortably. How very strange, she said. Do you know what might be missing? The pause before his answer was not long, but it was precisely long enough. I'm not sure, Arthur Alcott said. I'm not sure yet what was there to begin with. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably careful answer for a man who had just arrived in the village. A man encountering an unexpected disturbance in a dead woman's bureau might reasonably express surprise, or concern, or even outrage. He had expressed none of these things. He had expressed uncertainty about the inventory, which suggested he had a fairly clear idea of what ought to have been there, and was now calculating what the absence of it meant. The lane was quiet around them. Somewhere behind the wall, a robin was producing its thin, persistent autumn song. Mr. Alcott, Miss Marple said pleasantly, I wonder whether you have ever encountered a man named Adrien Fenwick. The robin continued. Arthur Alcott's face did not change, which was itself a very particular kind of change. No, he said. I don't believe I have. Chapter 8. The Lie in the Lane. Miss Marple walked back to Cecily's with the robin's song fading behind her, and Arthur Alcott's denial arranged neatly in her mind alongside everything else she had collected since Thursday. He had lied. She was quite certain of it, with the particular certainty that comes not from dramatic evidence, but from the accumulated weight of small observations pressed together. The slight delay before the answer, the stillness of his face in the moment before the stillness was deployed. The fact that a man genuinely unfamiliar with a name, when asked about it unexpectedly in a lane outside his dead aunt's house, does not produce a pause of that precise and managed quality. Surprise generates a different kind of silence, looser, less contained. Arthur Alcott's silence had been the silence of a man selecting. The question was what the lie covered. It might cover simple acquaintance, a meeting or two, a name recognized without significance. It might cover something considerably more purposeful. Between those two possibilities lay a considerable range of human behavior, and Miss Marple did not intend to collapse them into one another prematurely. She had made that error before, in the early days, and had learned from it with the thoroughness that comes from being wrong in ways that matter. She found Cecily in the garden, engaged in a dispirited assessment of the late-season dahlias, and joined her there for 10 minutes of companionable horticultural observation before steering the conversation, with the gentleness of long practice, toward the Alcott family history. Malcolm's boy, Cecily said, with the faint compression of someone who has chosen their words carefully. I always thought he got rather a raw deal, truth be told. Edward was a good man, but he was Evelyn's husband first, and his brother's memory second, if you follow me. Malcolm left debts, nothing scandalous, just the ordinary debris of a man who meant better than he managed. Arthur had to sort all of that at 23, on his own, and then watch Whitmore House go to Evelyn without so much as a conversation about whether some provision might have been made. Was there any expectation that there would be? Cecily considered. Malcolm always spoke as though Edward would see Arthur right. Those were the words, see him right. Whether Edward had actually given any undertaking, or whether Malcolm simply assumed it because it was the comfortable assumption, I couldn't tell you. But Arthur believed it. She paused. He came to Edward once, perhaps 2 years before Edward died. I heard about it from Evelyn. She was distressed by the visit. Arthur had apparently presented some kind of accounting, figures he'd worked out suggesting the estate was smaller than it ought to have been. And Edward's response? He sent Arthur away. He told Evelyn afterward that the boy was confused about how the partnership had been wound up, that the figures were wrong. She pulled absently at a dead dahlia stem. Evelyn believed him. She always believed him. But I noticed that Edward was very quiet in the weeks after that visit, quieter than usual, even for him. Miss Marple returned to her room after lunch and sat with her notebook, a small, plain thing she used for the kind of thinking that benefited from the discipline of the written word, and wrote out what she knew, what she suspected, and what she could not yet account for. Arthur Alcott had arrived in Ashenford with a key to Whitmore House and immediate knowledge of the Bureau's central drawer. He had lied about knowing Adrien Fenwick. He had come bearing a leather bag with the purposeful character of a man expecting to collect something, and he had left the house with the bag over his shoulder at the same angle it had arrived, which suggested its weight had not materially changed. Either the papers were not there, having been removed on Thursday morning by the unidentified visitor, or Arthur had found them and concealed them with considerable composure under Miss Marple's direct observation, which was possible but required a degree of sang-froid she had not quite decided to attribute to him. Adrien Fenwick had not appeared. His absence was beginning to acquire weight. There was a knock at Cecily's front door at 3:30. Ruth brought up a card, plain cream, with the name Adrien Fenwick, printed in the restrained typeface of a man who considers himself too established for ostentation. On the back, in a precise hand, I understand Miss Marple has been making inquiries. I would welcome a conversation at her convenience. I am at the White Hart in Braxted. Miss Marple read this twice, turned it over, and read the name on the front again. He had come to her. That was interesting in itself. A man with something to hide does not generally seek out the person asking questions. He avoids them, or if avoidance becomes impossible, he manages them from a position of apparent confidence. Adrien Fenwick had chosen to initiate, which suggested either genuine innocence, considerable confidence in his own narrative, or a determination to understand precisely how much she knew before she could ask him directly. All three of these were possible. The third was most consistent with the intelligence suggested by the action itself. She wrote a brief reply on Cecily's notepaper and sent Ruth to the post office to telephone it through to the White Hart. She would meet Mr. Fenwick at the Harrow and Hare in Ashenford the following morning at 10 o'clock. She specified the Harrow and Hare with deliberate intention. She wanted Fenwick in the village, not herself on neutral ground of his choosing. And she wanted, if Arthur Alcott happened to observe the encounter from the vicinity of Whitmore House, to observe his observation. Two men, both in the vicinity of Ashenford, both connected to a disputed inheritance, both linked to the death of a woman who had been quietly assembling a legal case against one of their families, and somewhere between them a set of papers that might or might not still exist. She added one further note to her notebook before closing it. Gerald Fitch had heard a man's voice inside Whitmore House at 8:20 on Thursday morning. Arthur Alcott, by his own account given to the constable in response to the telegram, had been in London until Friday morning. That account required a train ticket, or a witness, or both. She had not yet asked him for either. She found with some interest that she was looking forward to doing so. Chapter 9. The Man from Surrey. Adrien Fenwick arrived at the Harrow and Hare at 10:05. Miss Marple noted the punctuality with quiet appreciation. It was the punctuality of a man who had decided to make a particular impression and understood that arriving early signals anxiety, while arriving late signals disregard. 5 minutes before the hour was the careful middle ground of someone who had thought about the meeting in advance and intended to conduct it on his own terms, or as close to his own terms as the circumstances permitted. He was younger than she had expected from Bray's description, not in years, for 44 was what Bray had said, but in presentation he had the polished, maintained appearance of a man who moves regularly through rooms where appearance is a professional tool. Dark suit, well fitted, a face that was composed without being rigid, open without being warm. He carried nothing, no bag, no folder, no prop of any kind, which was itself a considered choice. He had come to talk, the absence of object said, not to transact. He shook her hand with a directness that stopped just short of the deliberate firmness people deploy when they wish to appear unguarded. "Miss Marple," he said, "thank you for agreeing to meet me. It was kind of you to write," she replied, and settled into her chair with the unhurried ease of a woman entirely comfortable with the proceedings. The lounge was quiet at this hour. The landlord had provided tea without being asked, which Miss Marple appreciated, and she poured for both of them with the domestic tranquillity of a hostess, which had the additional practical benefit of giving Fenwick the first minute of the meeting to arrange himself without the pressure of her direct attention. He began, as she had anticipated, with condolences. He expressed them well, neither too briefly nor with the excessive warmth that would have seemed rehearsed. He said he had not known Mrs. Alcott personally, but understood that her death had been a loss to the village, and that he hoped the family were managing. "Her nephew has arrived," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Arthur, did you know he was coming?" The smallest adjustment in Fenwick's expression, not a flinch, nothing so readable, a slight recalibration, as though a sentence he had prepared had become subtly less applicable. "I wasn't aware of his plans, no," he said. "He arrived yesterday morning," Miss Marple continued, in the same pleasant tone. "He seems very much his father's son in certain respects, though without the temperament. More contained, I would say." Fenwick accepted this observation without responding to it, which told her he knew enough about Malcolm Alcott to understand the comparison, but was not willing to confirm that knowledge. "Miss Marple," he said, settling forward slightly, "I'll be direct with you if I may. I understand that a solicitor named Bray has been making inquiries, historical inquiries, relating to a business partnership my father had with Edward Alcott. I also understand that Mrs. Alcott commissioned those inquiries. He paused. I am not here to obstruct anything. I want to be very clear about that. If there were irregularities in how my father managed that partnership, I would want to know. I have spent the past 3 years building a legitimate business, and I have no interest in having its foundations undermined by questions about my father's conduct 30 years ago. It was well said. Miss Marple gave it the careful consideration it deserved. That is a very reasonable position, she said. May I ask how you became aware that inquiries were being made? A colleague mentioned that certain property records from the late 1980s had been accessed, records relating to the Fenwick-Alcott partnership. In my line of business, you develop an awareness of when historical documentation connected to your assets is being examined. He said this without apology. I made my own inquiries and established that a firm called Bray and Associates had been commissioned. I did not know by whom until recently. And when you discovered it was Evelyn Alcott? I wrote to her, he said. 3 weeks ago. I introduced myself and suggested that a conversation might be more productive than legal proceedings. I received no reply. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a small, deliberate movement. You wrote to her? Yes. By post? Yes. Do you still have a copy of that letter? The pause was fractional, but present. I would have a copy on file, yes. I ask, Miss Marple said, with the gentle precision of someone clarifying a minor point, because Evelyn received 3 letters on Thursday morning that she did not open. We know one was from the electricity board and one was a seed catalogue. The third had a London postmark and a handwritten address in block capitals. She looked at him with the mild, steady attention that several people had found, by this point in their acquaintance with her, rather more penetrating than it appeared. Was your letter written by hand? Something shifted in Adrien Fenwick's face. Not guilt, she thought. Something more complicated than guilt, something that contained, at its edges, a quality she had not anticipated and which required immediate reassessment. It looked very much like genuine alarm. My letter, he said carefully, was typed, printed on company letterhead, posted from my Surrey office. He leaned forward by a fraction. Miss Marple, I wrote to Mrs. Alcott to propose a conversation. I did not go to Ashenford. I have never been to Ashenford before this morning. He paused. If there was a handwritten letter with a London postmark on that table, it was not from me. The fire in the grate made its small sounds. Somewhere above them, the inn was conducting its ordinary morning business. Miss Marple considered Adrien Fenwick's face for a long, quiet moment. She was, by long habit, alert to the particular texture of a well-constructed lie, the slight overproduction of detail, the careful establishment of alibi woven into ordinary conversation. She had heard a great deal of both in her lifetime. What she heard now was different. What she heard now was a man genuinely recalculating, genuinely alarmed, and underneath the alarm, something that might have been the specific anxiety of a person who has just understood that a situation he thought he was managing has become significantly larger than he supposed. If the handwritten letter had not come from Fenwick, and had not come from Arthur, and Arthur's letter, by his own account, was the promised second communication about visiting arrangements, unlikely to be deliberately disguised. Then there was a third party, someone else who had known about the Fenwick inquiries, someone else who had written to Evelyn Alcott in a hand designed to be anonymous, in the days before she died. Miss Marple looked at the window. at the lane beyond it, at the iron gate of Whitmore House just visible in the middle distance. 3 letters on a table. A woman who never opened them. She had been so occupied with who had come to Whitmore House that morning that she had not given sufficient attention to a prior question. What had been in that 3rd letter? And had Evelyn Alcott, contrary to what the unopened envelope suggested, already known? Chapter 10. The letter she already knew. Miss Marple walked back from the Harrow and Hare by the longer route. This was not inefficiency. It was the particular kind of thinking that requires movement. The slow, ambulatory turning of a problem that has just reconfigured itself into a different shape. She went along Medlar Street, past the post office, down the narrow passage beside the church that opened onto the older part of the village where the cottages sat closer together and the gardens were smaller and less considered. She walked without appearing to think, which was the manner in which she did her best thinking. A third party. Someone who knew about the Fenwick inquiries, who knew about Evelyn's correspondence with Bray, who had written to her in a disguised hand and chosen the timing of that letter with deliberate care. Not Fenwick, who had typed his approach on company letterhead with the confidence of a man establishing a paper trail. Not Arthur, whose letter concerned practical arrangements and who had his own reasons for the visit entirely separate from the Fenwick matter, or so he wished it to appear. Someone else. Someone who had access to information that should, by rights, have been contained between Evelyn, Bray, and the records themselves. She stopped at the church gate and stood for a moment looking at the yew tree in the churchyard, which was very old and very dark and entirely indifferent to the proceedings. Bray had mentioned a leak. Someone with access to the public records, searchers who had the means to identify the commissioning party. He had said this with the uncomfortable brevity of a man acknowledging a professional failure, and she had noted it and moved past it because there were more immediate questions at the time. She returned to it now with the careful attention it deserved. Who, besides Bray's firm, had known the full scope of what Evelyn was investigating? She had her answer by lunchtime, though it came from an unexpected direction. Ruth, clearing the lunch things, mentioned with the casual thoroughness of someone who considers all local information potentially relevant to her employer's guest, that a young woman had been seen at Whitmore House that morning. Not at the door, at the side gate, which was the one that Mrs. Peel used, and which faced the narrow passage between the houses rather than the lane. The young woman had stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, looking at the house, and then walked away in the direction of the High Street. Ruth had this from the milkman, whose round took him through the passage at 9:30, and who described her as dark-haired, well-dressed, perhaps 30, with the look of someone who had come with a purpose and thought better of it. Miss Marple asked Ruth to thank the milkman for his observational capacities, and went to find Cecily. A young woman, Cecily repeated, with the slight brightening of someone whose interest has been genuinely caught. Dark-haired, well-dressed. That might be any number of people. She paused. Although it might be the Prentice girl. Helen Prentice. She's perhaps 28 or 30. Dark. Very put together. She works in property. She's been in the village 2 or 3 times this autumn. I assumed she was looking at houses. Property, Miss Marple said. Do you know which firm? Cecily did not know, but Mrs. Pierce at the post office would. and Miss Marple was at the post office within 20 minutes. Mrs. Pierce consulted with the directness that saved considerable time in these interactions, confirmed that Helen Prentice had been seen in Ashenford on 3 separate occasions since September, and that she had mentioned in the context of a conversation about the village's amenities that had somehow arisen naturally at the counter that she was with a property development company based in Surrey. Surrey, the same county as Adrien Fenwick's business. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Pierce and walked to the Harrow and Hare, where she found Clement Bray in the residence lounge with the expression of a man who has been sitting with an uncomfortable thought for several hours and is relieved to have company. She told him about Helen Prentice without preamble. She watched the colour leave his face with the slow, definite quality of something draining. "Helen Prentice," he said. That was one of the junior associates at Fenimore and Drake, the firm I used for the record search. He set down his glass with excessive care. She left them in August. I assumed it was routine. People move firms. He looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man fully confronting his own professional error. She was the one who handled the initial records requests, so she knew what Evelyn was looking for. She knew everything, Bray said quietly. The scope of the search, the dates, the partnership records, the names. He paused. She would have known about the Fenwick connection before I did, in some respects. She was building the initial document file. And she left the firm in August, Miss Marple said, and is now apparently employed by or associated with a property company in Surrey. She allowed the implication to settle. Did you ever meet her in person? Once, a capable young woman. Precise, very composed. He looked at her. I thought she was simply good at her work. She may well be, said Miss Marple. The question is whose work she is currently good at. She returned to Cecily's at 3 and sat with her notebook for a long while. Helen Prentice had known about the investigation. She had taken that knowledge with her when she left Fenimore and Drake. She was now associated with a Surrey property company, appearing in Ashenford since September. 3 months of quiet observation. 3 months of watching Whitmore House and its occupant, learning the rhythms of the village. She had stood at the side gate that morning and thought better of approaching, or she had approached before, under different circumstances, and this morning's visit had been something else entirely. Assessment, perhaps, or the particular stillness of a person returning to a place where something has already been done. Miss Marple thought about the handwritten letter. Block capitals for the address, careful, deliberate, designed not to be traced. Typed, Fenwick had said of his own letter. Arthur's letter, by his account, was a practical communication about a visit. The third letter had been written by someone who did not wish to be identified, and who had timed its arrival with care. Someone who knew Evelyn's habits, her investigation, her correspondence with Bray. Someone who had been watching the village since September. She wrote Helen Prentice's name in her notebook and sat looking at it. The letter had not, she now believed, contained a threat. A woman who receives a threatening letter does not sit composed in her wingback chair in her best clothes. She locks her doors, or she telephones someone, or she burns it. She does not leave it unopened on the hall table with the electricity bill and the seed catalogue. Evelyn Alcott had not opened that letter because she had already known what was in it, which meant the letter was not new information, it was confirmation, or a response to something Evelyn herself had set in motion. She had contacted someone, Miss Marple thought, someone besides Bray, someone she had not mentioned to Cecily or Mrs. Pierce or anyone in the village, and that someone had written back. On the morning, she died. Chapter 11. What the Morning Knew. Miss Marple did not sleep particularly well on Monday night. This was not unusual when a problem had reached the stage of near completion without quite arriving. It was the particular restlessness of a mind that has assembled the majority of a picture and is circling the remaining pieces with the knowledge that they exist, and the frustration of not yet knowing precisely where they fit. She lay in Cecily's spare room and listened to the church bell marking the hours with its familiar hesitation on the third chime, and she thought about Evelyn Alcott sitting composed in her wingback chair, hands arranged in her lap, dressed and pinned, and ready for a morning that had not proceeded, as she had intended. Ready. That was the word that had been troubling her since Thursday, moving beneath the surface of everything else like a current beneath still water. Evelyn had been ready, not caught unawares, not surprised in the middle of ordinary morning business. She had been dressed and settled and waiting, in the chair that faced both the window and the bureau, as though she had expected company, and had chosen to receive it in a particular way. By 4 a.m, Miss Marple had the shape of it.
By 7 she had confirmed 3 things by telephone. Raymond had been prompt with his London enquiries, and Bray had been helpful in ways that clearly cost him some professional discomfort, but which he provided with the conscientious thoroughness of a man settling a debt. The third confirmation came from Inspector Slack, who had arrived in Ashenford late the previous evening without announcing himself, and had spent Monday night at the Harrow and Hare, which Miss Marple had anticipated and arranged for with a brief telephone call on Sunday afternoon.
She met Slack at the Harrow and Hare at 8:30. He received her summary with the particular expression he reserved for her, a compound of reluctant attention and suppressed exasperation that had over the years acquired a thin but genuine layer of respect. "You'll need the death certificate reviewed," she said. "A second opinion on the cardiac findings. I believe you will find that Evelyn Alcott's heart failure was assisted. Not dramatically, nothing that announces itself, something that accelerates what was already a vulnerable condition. Her doctor's notes will show the history." Slack wrote this down without commenting on it, which was his way of indicating he considered it serious. The man's voice Gerald Fitch heard was not Arthur Alcott. Miss Marple continued. Arthur was in London. His train ticket and 2 separate witnesses at a breakfast meeting confirm it. The voice belonged to Adrien Fenwick, who told me he had never been to Ashenford, which was the second significant lie I had been told in this matter, though considerably more dangerous than the first. "You said a second lie," Slack said. "What was the first?" "Arthur Alcott told me he had never met Adrien Fenwick." He had. They met twice in September. In London, Raymond found the connection through a mutual business contact. They were not, however, working together in the way I initially suspected. The meetings were contentious. Arthur had approached Fenwick independently, having formed his own suspicions about the estate discrepancy, and Fenwick had rebuffed him. Arthur came to Ashenford to see his aunt because he believed she had assembled evidence that would support a legal claim, and he wanted access to that evidence before anyone else reached it. He did not know about Bray. He did not know about Helen Prentice.
"And who is Helen Prentice?" Miss Marple explained, with the precise economy of someone who has arranged the explanation carefully in advance. Slack's expression darkened as she proceeded. Helen Prentice had not been recruited by Adrien Fenwick. She had inserted herself. A junior associate at Fenimore and Drake with access to the Alcott records search, she had recognised the value of what she was handling and had made her own approach to Fenwick in August, offering in exchange for a position in his company both her silence about the investigation and her
ongoing intelligence about its progress. Fenwick had accepted. It was, Miss Marple noted, the kind of arrangement that suited both parties until it ceased to suit either. What Fenwick had not anticipated was that Evelyn Alcott, a quiet and careful woman of 71, had been considerably more active than her circumstances suggested. She had written to someone, Miss Marple said. Not Bray, not Arthur, not anyone in the village. She had written directly to a contact at the land registry, a retired official she had known through Edward's business affairs, a man named Patterson, who had worked with the partnership records in the late 1980s, and who had, it transpired, his own long-held unease about what he had processed. During those years, Patterson had written back. His letter confirmed what Bray had only suspected, that the transfers had required internal facilitation, that someone within the registry process had enabled them. Slack looked up from his notes. Patterson's letter, Miss Marple said quietly, was what Fenwick came to Whitmore House to retrieve on Thursday morning. Not the Bray correspondence. He knew about that through Prentice and considered it manageable. Patterson's letter was the element he had not known existed until Prentice intercepted a telephone call between Evelyn and Bray, in which Evelyn mentioned, with the satisfied precision of a woman who has finally assembled her case, that she had independent corroboration from inside the process itself. How did Fenwick get in? The key from Margaret Dowell's hook. He had been in the village before, quietly, briefly, in October, when Prentice identified Ashenford for him, and he conducted his own assessment. He would have noted the key arrangement then. It is the sort of thing a careful man notes. Slack closed his notebook. And Mrs. Alcott? Miss Marple looked at the window for a moment. Evelyn knew he was coming. I believe she had worked it out. Perhaps not Fenwick by name, but someone connected to the Fenwick interest. She had received the anonymous letter from Prentice 2 days earlier, warning her obliquely that her investigation had been compromised, and Evelyn, being the woman she was, had drawn her conclusions and made her preparations. She paused. She dressed carefully. She sat in the chair that allowed her to watch both the door and the bureau. She had moved Patterson's letter. It was not in the bureau when Fenwick searched it. I believe she had it on her person. Then where is it now? With Inspector Linley at the Braxted station, Miss Marple said. Evelyn posted a copy to her solicitor in Braxted on Wednesday afternoon, the day before she died. Recorded delivery. It arrived Friday morning, while the village was still absorbing the news of her death, and her solicitor, being a careful man, retained it unopened pending instruction. She folded her hands in her lap. She had also, I think, taken something to manage the encounter, her heart medication, in a higher dose than prescribed, against the stress of what she expected. It was not quite enough. The shock of the physical confrontation, Fenwick's presence in the room, the argument, her heart failed genuinely. But it was assisted by the circumstances he created, which was not, Inspector Slack agreed, the same as natural causes. They found Adrien Fenwick at the White Hart in Braxted, preparing to check out. He received Slack's arrival with the specific composure of a man who has been expecting something of this nature and has decided that composure is his best remaining instrument. He did not produce the Patterson letter, because he had not found it. He denied everything with the smooth, experienced denial of a man who has solicitors on retainer and knows how to use them. It did not, ultimately, help him. The Patterson letter was sufficient. Helen Prentice, faced with the full accounting of her position, made the calculation that a partial disclosure served her considerably better than solidarity with a man who had already begun constructing a version of events in which she bore primary responsibility. Arthur Alcott sat in Whitmore House for 3 days after the arrest, going through his aunt's papers with the thoroughness of a man who has waited a long time and intends to be methodical about it. He came to see Miss Marple on the Thursday, 1 week exactly after Evelyn's death, and sat in Cecily's small sitting-room with his hands on his knees, and said that he owed his aunt a considerable apology that he was no longer able to deliver. Miss Marple said that in her experience the best apologies to the dead were made through the living, and that pursuing the matter properly through the appropriate legal channels would constitute a reasonable beginning. He nodded, and seemed to find this, if not comforting, then at least workable. After he left, Miss Marple sat for a while with her knitting in the quiet of Cecily's sitting-room. The afternoon was pale and still. The blackbird had returned to the herbaceous border with its customary confidence, and she watched it for several minutes without thinking about anything in particular. Evelyn Alcott had kept papers for 20 years out of loyalty to a husband who had been too proud or too broken to explain himself. She had assembled her case with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of a woman who understood that careful work takes time, and she had posted her evidence on a Wednesday afternoon, knowing that Thursday morning might require a kind of courage she was not certain her heart could sustain. It had not quite sustained it. But the letter had arrived. The case had held. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and turned it in her hands and thought that there were worse epitaphs for a careful woman than that. Outside, the church bell struck the quarter hour with its familiar hesitation on the third chime. Ashenford continued, as it always had, in the quiet and particular way of places that have absorbed one more truth about themselves and chosen, on the whole, to go on.